me okay? Yes? Good morning to everyone in the stream as well. I'm going to wave to you, all of you joining us online. I'm happy to have all of you back with us in this room. We called this building a spaceship yesterday, and this really does feel a little bit like a spaceship, I think, and I can turn around and wave to the people behind us as well. I'm glad that you're all back with us this morning for day 2 of Q Berlin, the new unknown navigating Zeitenwende. If you joined us yesterday, we got through quite a bit of content, 3 terrific topics, and the idea is that we drill down into them today with longer discussions, these deep dives, and we have a number of terrific guests who will be speaking to you today as well and speaking with you. That's the point as well, also in this more intimate atmosphere. We'll hear from Francesca Bria again. Also, we'll have Stefan Schwarz, who is the Senator for Economics, Energy and Public Enterprises here in Berlin. Peter Pomerantsev will be up in the afternoon, and Carson Chan from MoMA. So a lot of voices you definitely want to hear. I hope my microphone is, yes, now I think you can all hear me. Good, great. We will be able, as I said, to bring you into the conversation directly. So for this morning, we have a good hour and a half to discuss. So maybe we'll just at the end of the conversation that we have here between us, you can raise your hands and put questions to us as well. I am very happy to start with a terrific group this morning who I'm going to introduce briefly. You will have seen 2 of these speakers yesterday with us remotely and on stage. So we have Maren Urner now with us live in person. She's a neuroscientist and professor of media psychology. We have the co-founder of the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy with us, Kristina Lunz. And also very happy to welcome back Frank Sieren, a journalist and an expert on all things China. So if we can get a round of applause for our speakers this morning. Just a reminder, if you're going to tweet anything out or put anything out in social media, do remember to use that hashtag QBerlin2022. So with that, I'll hand over to Maren, who will get us started with a talk.
Yeah, so in contrast, so first of all, I'm really flashed by this building. I'm still trying to get the atmosphere here, and the feeling that people are behind me is a bit awkward. But okay, my mic, I'm trying again. Talk about what I had for breakfast, maybe. That's what you usually do on the radio, and it works. Can you hear me now? Test, test, test. Is that better? Yeah? Okay. So now, after I talked about this building and not my breakfast, I want to maybe start this deep dive with what I tried to get across in 11 minutes yesterday, so really condensed time. A bit more detailed version, not that I'm going to speak longer than 11 minutes, don't be scared, but maybe focus really on the last bit, so what I call the dynamic thinking and the 3 ingredients of the dynamic thinking and why I am 100% certain that we need more of that. So I introduced those 3 ingredients already shortly yesterday, and the first one is really to ask what for instead of against what. And I want to dive a little bit into, or dig a bit deeper, why that is so important. Because it mentally changes us if we ask, what do I want to achieve? Where do I want to go to? And what can we combine in order to get to this new foreign unknown place? Because if you imagine life as basically a line, right? So I'm not sure whether you can all see me now, but if we are here now, yeah, and this is the past and that's the future, if we ask the question, what are we against, then we look into the past. So we automatically focus on what's bad, and we look for scapegoats, and we look for people and places and everything, organizations who are doing something wrong. And that puts us in this position where we feel like, okay, we have to fight. Sometimes also fight or flight, this biological response. We either fight or we fly or run, in the case of humans, or we freeze if we are unable to do anything. But if we ask ourselves, looking forward, what do we want to achieve? And where do we want to go to? We have to use what makes us humans unique and what separates us from all other beings on this planet, which is our power to imagine things. And you all know the famous song by John Lennon, I'm pretty sure, Imagine. He all knew it. And that's what we have to use more, because that's where we really use our brain to the full scope, so to say. Sometimes people say we only use 10% of our brain. That's BS. That's one of these brain myths, just as a side note. But that's really the point when we ask and start to ask the question more, where do we want to go to? And we start to imagine things. We have to come up with new things. And that brings me to the second ingredient. So after asking what do we want to achieve, where do we want to go to, we have to ask who belongs. Who's part of this? Who's going to be part of this journey? And that's what I mean when I say we have to redefine groups. Because this group thinking is really programmed into us. Whenever we enter a room, for example, the room like here, we group. We look like who has my gender, we look like who has my age, we look like who has my hair color, and all these kind of things, skin color, shoe size, favorite music, political direction, whatever. We group immediately, and we can't help it. That's our brain. But we can do it in a better way, by redefining groups, and by not looking first and foremost what's separating us. For example, I could say, okay, I feel like I'm a woman, and that person looks like a man, so we have two groups. Or we can ask the question, what combines us? What connects us? What's the minimal thing that we can talk about because we share it? And that could be, for example, here today, this is all people who are trying to come up with a better future. Click, we have a new group. Or people who share this moment in this room now. And why is that so important? And why is it not just a mind game or some kind of nice idea? Because it creates trust. And there's tons of studies that show this. Like even if I would hand out, that's my favorite study, if I would hand out little party hats to half of you now, and the other half would get, I don't know, nothing or something else, you would immediately feel more connected and trust more the people if you have a party hat who also have a party hat, even if you've never seen them before. And even if they have the different gender, skin color, and whatsoever. So we can redefine these groups by really simple, I don't want to say manipulation, because often people get scared when they hear the word manipulate and they think it's something bad and negative, but by consciously thinking about how do we talk about people and groups. And that brings me to the third and last ingredient, and then I'm done with my little input here, and that is that we have to tell new stories. And that's not only about the groups, but also what a good life means, and what success means, and what a healthy life means. Because there is this big paradox, and I already talked about it shortly yesterday, that we are all living, right? We know we have to talk about sustainability, the future. I mean, for me, it's like a synonym. It's the same, basically. We can call it sustainability, we can call it future orientation, whatever. It's all about how, and that connects to the first ingredient, how do we want to live in the future? Where do we go from here? And what makes good ingredients in order to get there? And we've been telling a lot of wrong stories. And what I mean by wrong stories, it doesn't mean that I have a different opinion about it, but it's that it's not backed up by science. We have decades of studies that show us what really helps people thrive, what makes them healthy, happy people. And the most important ingredient is functional social relationships, full stop. And we have to start telling this story more, and we have to tell the story that what connects us is also what makes us successful, which is if we collaborate and work together. And that's where I want to end with, and see where we go, not end with, but end my little input with, and then see where we go from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Maren. I'm going to hand over to Kristina now for her input to get us started.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to glance at my phone now and then. Maybe not. Let's see how this goes. So I want to talk about how the private is political. Many of you might not be surprised. That is one of kind of the key feminist slogans out there. I'll be talking about how experience that I made and anger that I felt in the private and in the small is connected to the big developments in the world. And actually what you just talked about looking back, and then a lot of my activism, the work that I've been doing, has been influenced by looking back and seeing what I believe has been wrong, and then formulating this vision for the future that really is the driver behind all the work that I am and my team and my organization are doing. So I want to tell you a little story about a big newspaper, Bild newspaper, about anger and about peace and war, peace and security. In 2014, I was incredibly angry, like genuinely angry. In 2014, for the first time at uni, I learned about the the connection between, for example, whenever a certain group of people gets objectified, and objectification can, for example, happen through sexualization, this group of people will experience more violence, because whenever we see people not as humans but dehumanize them and understand them as objects, the level of violence that is exerted towards that group of people will increase. So that is one thing I knew. I learned, and then when I was back in my little village where I'm from, I was at the petrol station and there was the Bild newspaper lying in front of me. And Bild newspaper on the front page asked its readers to rate Germany's most beautiful cleavage. So they had only pictures of women's cleavages, no faces, nothing, only the cleavages, and asked the readers to rate them. That made me incredibly angry, because that is exactly that objectification, this sexualization. And at the same time, we know that in Germany, like everywhere in the world, but also in Germany, despite sometimes thinking we might be progressive, in Germany we have an incredibly high rate of violence against women. In Germany, every day a man tries to kill his partner or ex-partner, and every third day he succeeds. It is estimated that only 1% of rapists are actually sentenced. So we have this normalization for male violence and this impunity for male violence in Germany. So I was so angry, and there's this beautiful author, she's called Rebecca Traister, and she wrote this book about women's anger and how women's anger really has had the power to transform the world. And she says that anger, because of injustices and a lack of equity, really is kind of the motor for social change in our world. And in her book, she talks about the stories of Rosa Parks and the suffragettes and so many more feminists that have paved the way for many of us for a more just society. What happened then? When I was angry, I wrote an open letter. I started a petition. This turned into a campaign. This led to lots of media interest. And with this, for the first time in my life, I experienced massive online violence. Countless messages that were sent to me through all different channels, explaining in detail how I should be raped, what should happen to my family, what kind of violence people would like to do towards me. I was shocked. I had no idea that this would happen to women who speak up. Now I know that this is systematic to all women who challenge the status quo and all politically marginalized groups. Back then I was shocked, surprised, I cried. I was convinced I would never speak up again. And then, though, with kind of a little bit of distance, I started to understand that this sense of entitlement that these people who sent those messages to me, that is not much different to the sense of entitlement that authoritarian leaders such as Bolsonaro and Putin and Trump and Erdogan and all these figures have, like this entitlement to a world and a structure that for the past 4,000 to 6,000 years has been built almost exclusively based on the needs and the demands of men from a certain group. So this has been the society for a couple of thousand years with its rules, and the second someone challenges that, repercussions will follow. This is called patriarchy. And the consequences of patriarchy, they're massive. They go way beyond this kind of online violence or sexualization that I just mentioned, or the violence that women and politically marginalized groups experience kind of in the small, in the private, so-called private. In fact, The US-American professor Valerie Hudson and her team, they did some fantastic work. They created the largest data set on the situation of women worldwide. They looked at 176 countries, and they found that the most significant factor towards whether a country is peaceful within its borders and towards other countries is the level of gender equality. They showed with the multiple regressions that they calculated, they showed that the level of oppression towards women and other politically marginalized groups accurately shows the level of violence those countries exert towards other countries. The more patriarchal a society, the less, the worse the governance of the country, the worse health indicators, the worse economic indicators. So, with that, they have concluded and can be concluded that without feminism, and by that the active attempt to undo patriarchal structures, without feminism there can not be peace and security anywhere in the world. This knowledge, that's not new. For a couple of years now, we've had a handful of states around the world, starting with Sweden in 2014, that have announced a feminist foreign policy because they understand this research. But it didn't start with Sweden. It was in 1915 that 1,200 feminists came together during the First World War in The Hague, and they made actually those demands of restructuring the international system based on human security instead of militarized security. And by now, we have more than 10 countries in the world that officially have a feminist foreign policy. Those countries are trying to connect the private with the political. They're making the statement that what happens to people within their house has an impact and is directly correlated to peace, security, and war and conflicts worldwide. The German government announced a feminist foreign policy in its coalition agreement last November, and only this past Monday, our first female and feminist foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, and her team, they hosted their first feminist foreign policy conference in the foreign ministry here in Berlin. This ultimately, trying to reform foreign policy will be the most promising chance to really tackle the world's biggest challenges, and that is pandemics, the climate crises, war, conflicts, because all of these can never be tackled by states alone, but only internationally, and only if those states, when they work together, apply a feminist approach, will the attempts to tackle those challenges actually lead to sustainable peace and security. Thank you.
Yes, thanks a lot. I learned already a lot of new things, and when we started this morning, I was not sure how we can connect, but now I'm totally. Now I know why we're sitting together here. I learned about views that you can look backwards and forwards. I learned about the role of marginalized groups. I learned about new stories if you have a different perspective, and I learned about that your personal kind of life is connected to a global life as well. And that's actually pretty much what I'm dealing with as someone, as a Westerner who's living for now almost 30 years in China. And as living there, I went there by accident, actually. Followed a woman, and if the woman would have gone to Bulgaria, nothing against Bulgaria, I would have gone there. Now I'm much more happy that I'm in China. But I had to basically to learn that these people have a different perspective on the world. And actually, when you were saying people looking backwards and people looking forwards, I would immediately say Western people tend to look backwards and Asian people tend to look forwards. And we have a long queue of people in London looking backwards. They're mourning not only Queen Elizabeth, but they're also mourning, and that's why they're standing there overnight for 10 hours. They're mourning the past, the British Empire, when the United Kingdom was more powerful, more glorious, and now they understand that these times are over. And then they tend to look back. And when I think about why people tend to look forward and backwards on a global level, then I immediately actually see that it has to do with their position. And actually people who tend to lose their position, they tend to look backwards. And people who see a future, a brighter future, they tend to look forwards. And on a global level, as I was saying yesterday already briefly, we have a tremendous change now, because about 500 years of colonial or imperialistic times are getting to their end. And these times were basically, or the strongest rule of these times was that the West, the minority, and you can say the white male minority of the West, was able to set the rules for the world. And these times are over now, and now the Asians, but also people in Africa and South America, they don't want to be told anymore what they have to do and what they don't have to do. And if the American president, Joe Biden, talks about that Asian countries, India or China, should follow the international world order, then these people are saying, yeah, but that's not our order. That's your order, and we want a different story. We have a different perspective on it. And the problem right now is that the Western people, they don't understand the different perspective of the emerging countries. And if they don't understand, there will be no dialogue. It's no dialogue possible, because then they're talking of different things. So what we in the West, we need to learn to switch perspectives, to learn that there are different perspectives, that there are different stories, and that's a very important thing I learned as well, and there are different and new groups coming up, and the connection and the strength of certain groups is changing all the time. I give you one example. We traditionally think in the West that there is a division between democratic countries and authoritarian countries. From an Asian point of view, there's a stronger belonging. There's established countries, a group of established countries, and there's a group of emerging countries. And even people in India and China and South Korea, they have probably a stronger feeling for being part of emerging countries than of being part of a different political system. And this perspective made it easier to build the biggest free trade zone in the world, where you have all kinds of different countries, small, not very developed countries like Laos, different religions, Muslims, Christians in the Philippines, big countries like China, dictatorships like China, democracies like Indonesia, but they still belong to one group and they feel like it, and this group is the group of the people who are emerging, who are getting more power and who want to decide more and more themselves what's good for them, and not to want to be told by other countries what they have to do or not to do. And actually, there was a similar development in Europe. with the aristocrats and the normal people. The aristocrats have been a minority setting the rules for the majority. And suddenly, in the 19th century, in France a little earlier with the French Revolution, people were saying, no, yeah, you're setting the rules for a long time, and probably it was quite successful, but we have our own ideas. And this was basically, this was the start that the aristocrats were going to lose constantly power. And the smart aristocrats, they joined the new rising groups, the new emerging groups. They worked together with them. There are even aristocrats which joined the French Revolution on the side of the normal people. So if we put this perspective on a global level, then we in the West, the minority of the West, we are now, right now, we are the aristocrats. And from Asia, Africa, and South America, this perspective is totally clear. But it's very, very difficult for us to understand it. Because we think our values, and for good reasons, we think our values are the best, and if everyone follow our values, everything will be good. But it's not so easy. I totally agree, and I even learned in a country like China how important press freedom is, how important the participation of the civil society is, how important the rule of law is, because if you live in Germany, you take it for granted somehow. But still, I understand that I cannot force these people to do what I want anymore, because they're so strong, they're so they're so proud of themselves that they want to decide themselves. So the question is right now, what can we do to integrate our values into this new world order? Because we are convinced of them, the others need to be convinced. And the only way is dialogue and is switching perspective. We need to see the world with their views, to be able, in a better way, able to make ourselves convincing, to be more convincing in a way that they don't feel forced by us to do something they don't want to do, but they can say, yes, now we understand, we probably want to do it differently, and even in a country like China, which is a dictatorship right now, people are interested in democracy and in participation and so on. So, but we need to find a way. We need to find a way to understand each other. And sanctions, they don't work anymore, because sanctions means I'm stronger than you and I force you what to do. And in our time, sanctions means that the opposition will be even stronger, even if the sanctions are given for right reasons. And that's the reason why 170 countries worldwide don't follow the Western sanctions against Russia. It's not why they don't agree that the war is a wrong war, but they think the sanctions it's a power tool of the old times, where the minority could dominate the majority. And that's actually, I think, our goal for the future, to see this different perspective and to see how we can get along better. And it didn't really work even in Germany, between East and Western Germany. The Western Germans always said, yes, but yeah, now you have a better life. And the East Germans were saying, yeah, but all our life is gone. And all what we were used to, and even if we were critical against the political system, it was our life. And then, if both sides are not able to switch perspective, then it's useless to talk. That's it for the moment.
Thank you to all three of you for getting us started. And like you said, Frank, I think there are a lot of points of convergence where we can pick up on to discuss. And I'll start asking questions, but please gather yours because we'd love to bring in your questions as well. Maren, to pick up on something you had said that I wrote down, you said we should not stand necessarily against something, but for something. Doesn't the current era that we live in and the political polarization, this is a political framing of this question, of course, demand that we stand against certain things, of course for certain things, but also against them? And the question also about looking forward, which Frank said perhaps people in Asia do more than people in the West. Here in Germany, you have a tradition of looking back to responsibly look forward. So how do you reconcile those things?
Yeah. It's a very important question, and I often ask, but isn't it good if we are against, for example, discrimination to certain groups, right? If we are against the destruction of our environment, if we are against, and now you can name all bad things that are happening in the world. And yes, of course, I would never disagree, say, that's a good feeling, a good motivation to have. But we have to go one step further, and that's what Kristina referred to quite nicely when she said, first I looked back, what was annoying, where was this anger and all these, what we often call negative emotions. Maybe we can come to that as well, because they are important emotions, and I'm actually against calling them positive or negative emotions, because they can be the starting point, because you realize there's something wrong, something doesn't feel right, and then you can ask yourself, what is that? You don't have to ask why, just ask what is happening. And that's where the communication then can start as well. So I'm trying to connect the dots already a little bit. I hope that's becoming clear. And if you have that figured out and you start talking to other people, what you're feeling and what is disturbing you, then, and that's the most important step then to make in order to switch your internal perspective, you have to ask yourself, okay, what do I want? Instead of fighting, because this fighting mode creates this mental state of fear, of fight or flight or freeze, those three responses we have on a biological and psychological basis, so to say, that we are against something. It immediately creates this in-group more. It strengthens the not taking each other's perspective. It strengthens I'm against something, so I have to make the strongest point against something or somebody else. And in comparison to that, if I ask, okay, what do I want to achieve? It creates this open space first in your head, but also in the world, on the political stage, because you have to start talking. Because it's not there yet. You have to create it. So even if you think, okay, that person thinks democracy means that, and that person means, well, it's more important that we believe in this or that world order, you have to start from something that's not there. And that's the perfect, I want to call it breeding ground here maybe, for coming together, for changing perspective, for honestly, and that's a very important ingredient, honestly asking other people, so where do you want to go? Mm-hmm. It's really a different, it sometimes sounds a bit lofty or fluffy, right? You just have to think about it different. But it's really a fundamental different state. And if you are in a different state, that way the most important aspect here, I think we are trying to, or I hope you agree with me, but please disagree if you feel like you, is that the private life is immediately and always connected to the political life. Yeah. You can't separate it. And we come up with these dichotomies all the time. I refer to another one, negative versus positive emotions, private versus political. And our brain likes that because it needs to put labels on things. But it's not that easy. And if we're honest to ourselves, we know there's all these gray scales in between. And of course, I'm a person here. I'm a private person. I'm a public person now. But we shouldn't try artificially to separate those things. And that's when we come together and ask, where do we want to go?
Frank,
it's even if we disagree on lots of points, we need to find clusters of agreement. That's the only way. If you look forward, that's the only way to go. So it makes no sense to sit and to say I disagree, because it's useless. Yeah, the first step would be to see if there's a point where we can agree on, because then automatically we're looking forward. And then we can, in a second step, we can discuss on points we disagree and probably find compromises, find ways where we can put our different views together. And that's that's right now not working on a global policy level, because now it's more on focusing on what we disagree. And if you see now the Russians and the Chinese, they're meeting in Kazakhstan. And it's interesting to see the wording, because Beijing is basically mad on Putin that he started the war. They don't really want it, but they don't want to separate from him because they have a 4,000 kilometers border. So what should they do if they look forward? They want to say, okay, we don't like it, but we still need to work together. There's a need to work together. They need the natural resources to get the climate change in time, done in time, and several other reasons. So now you see the wording. Putin is saying friendship and trust, and the Chinese don't say friendship and trust anymore, but they say pragmatic cooperation. And that's the way out. Yeah? If the Chinese would have said, like we want to say, that Putin is a stupid aggressor who started the war, then the dialogue would not be possible anymore. And that's the different way of thinking. Even if you're right, or to compare it with my personal life, if I don't like something my wife has done, I will not talk publicly on a party with her friends to make sure that she is hit hard by my critical position that she's going to change. I would do actually the other way. I would go the other way. I would choose a certain time and a certain place. I would try to understand her. I would choose words which make sure that she can understand. The problem is on the global policy level, we do exactly like boof. So, if the one we are hitting is weak enough, probably the one is falling over. But if he's not or she's not weak enough, the opposition will be even stronger. And that's actually I learned from your because I don't deal with brains. I only deal with.
Well, you do
only deal with people.
You deal with brains all the time because you have a brain.
Yes,
so.
You're right.
So I just want to ask Kristina to come into the conversation quickly. What would the feminist foreign policy approach to what Frank is discussing be?
Well, also trying to connect both of them. Feminist foreign policy approach, is very aware of that, how all the crises that we see in the world are a direct product of of systems around in societies around the world that cater only for a minority. You mentioned it before. Globally speaking, it's a white male minority that has made rules over thousands of years, and it just doesn't work for the majority. We see it if we look at indicators of the Sustainable Development Goals, if we look at how that $2 billion annually spent on defense and militarization, and when only less than 0.5% of that budget is spent on UN peacekeeping, like no matter what indicators we're looking at, the system that's been built of international politics and how we allocate money, whose rights we defend, whose rights we accept to be violated, and so forth, it doesn't work for the majority. The feminist movement, if we look at it, it's like 200 to 250 years old, so pretty young compared to 4,000 to 6,000 years of a patriarchal society. But at the same time, the feminist movement has achieved so many transformative changes and has already led to an improvement of the lives of so many people around the world. And they've done it, and the movement has been doing it with a mix of being extremely radical, of course, so not much about dialogue, because the movement and different movements at some point have realized that if the oppression is so harsh that you would not even at all be heard at. More radical measures have to be used. But then at the same time, part of the feminist movement has tried to use other ways. And if we look at feminist foreign policy, it really is activism turned into diplomacy. So whilst the demands in their core, they are unapologetic when it comes to defending women's rights, when it comes to not being willing to compromise, for example, on women's right to their own bodies. When we have countries like the US turning over Roe v. Wade, when we have countries like Poland implementing an almost total ban on abortions, when we have countries like Turkey leaving the Istanbul Convention that defends women's rights, and so forth. So being unapologetic and not being willing to make compromises on the very core things that kind of defends and makes our humanity, but at the same time being open, 100% being open to all diplomatic tools and communication and dialogue to achieve it. And very often people think that you cannot have a strong Haltung, a very strong position on something, and at the same time be soft and well-meaning and a good communicator, right? But that is not true. And I feel, for example, if we look at our foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, whom in the beginning so many said, especially when she started talking about a feminist foreign policy, like, what? Do we want to throw, like, softballs towards Putin? Like, that's been bullshit, of course, because you can be soft in your approach and open and communicative, and at the same time being very strong on your values and what you want to achieve.
Okay. There was a question here, if you want to just shout it out. I think the microphones will pick these up, but go ahead.
Okay. Heine Banking, I fully resonate with you. We need common frames of references. That was our outcome 92 after the negotiations in Rio at UNCED. But how to do it? I often say we need to define solution spaces. All this crisis, hidden agendas, splitted views is not helping us if we don't create this embodied common frames of references. And now, in the 30 years, we can use the word mindset or mind prints. It is now possible, and I think you mentioned it with system sciences, that we all label and maybe we make a network. In Germany, in '58, the general model theory was introduced by Herbert Stachowiak. And I'm in the field to bridge, because when we use models, mental models, artistic models, and not just mathematical models like we use in English and nobody understands models has many meanings, then we have a chance to go into this deep meaning of how our mind, holographic or whatever, might work, and how to make it concrete. And we can do it by going beyond this dualistic trap of me, you, but really, we call it house of eyes, worm's eye, fish eye, bird's eye, group eye, generation eye, or me model, you model, they model. Let's do, with architecture, such new mappings and modelings.
Anybody want to pick up on that?
Sorry, I still need to get accustomed to this room. I'm doing it like you now. I learned solution orientation, move the microphone instead of the chair. That's easier. So, talking about solutions, I usually quote Steve DeChaser, who said, problem talk creates problems and solution talks create solutions. And that's really this mind shift or mind change or taking the different perspective that you asked about as well, and that we've been talking about now in the last half hour or so. It really creates a different mindset. And now the big question is, as we've kind of like trying to pinpoint now, how do we get there, right? Because if there are people who are so trapped because of habits, because of personal habits, cultural habits, historical habits, and it's tricky again to separate these because they are all interconnected, but still these habits can be very strong. And how do you wake up people? And then I like to say, well, crises are first and foremost turning points. They are turning points because now we are woken up, basically, independent of whether it's the climate crisis or any other connected crisis. Like you said, they are all connected because fundamentally, and that's something I learned not so long ago, they are all a question of equality, actually. A question of where do we want to live, how do we want to live, and how do we want to talk about how we want to live in order to get there. So it really comes down to this very simple question, and of how do we open up people? Well, depending on how many crises we need, or as a biologist / neuroscientist, I like to say how many hot hubs we need to touch, right? In order to make us feel, oh yeah, that's really hot, I'm burning my hand. Yeah. So how bad does it need to be? Change by design or disaster? How many people need to be killed to literally say this out loud? That's the questions we need to talk about. That's the honesty we need on a political level, on a personal level. And like you said, on a personal level, if we are solution oriented, we really try to bring the best argument in order to find some common ground. Whereas on the political stage, we often do the opposite. Yes. And that's just stupid.
And actually, feminist foreign policy should be dialogue based.
It is.
Yes. Yeah. I don't see it so far with Annalena Baerbock. There could be a bit more dialogue centered approach. It's actually what I think the strength about feminist movement is, that the feminist movement is saying we are different, it's good we are different, and we want to have the same rights as the others, and we want to decide ourselves. And if you transfer this to foreign policy, then I would say Frank-Walter Steinmeier is much more feminist than Annalena Baerbock right now.
That's quite a statement.
Yeah.
Oh, that should be a good tweet.
Somebody tweet that, please.
Yeah. Probably it's because she's a beginner in international politics and she still needs to learn.
Oh, no.
But the way she's arguing, she's saying, that's our rules, you need to follow our rules. If you don't follow our rules, we're going to punish you. That's her policy. And I don't think that's a smart way to go right now. And I have to admit I'm a bit disappointed. Probably she needs another year to learn how it works because she had no experience in international politics at all, and probably takes a while. And Frank-Walter Steinmeier, when he started, he was already very, very experienced in international politics. But if I would talk in terms of feminist foreign policy, that would be the direction I would look and I would go.
I'll let Kristina answer. There's lots of hands shooting up now around the room, but first I'll let Kristina answer. There's one back there that was first.
Well, I'm not the spokesperson of Annalena Baerbock, and at the same time, just want to make sure that we're not going down this rabbit hole of kind of making the expertise of women smaller than those of men. We're not doing that here because Annalena Baerbock is incredibly experienced international lawyer with tons of experience and in politics, highly qualified. And Frank-Walter Steinmeier, I'm also not here to judge him, but he's most definitely not feminist. I guess Frank-Walter Steinmeier did not have to deal with a war in Europe, and there are many other situational factors that definitely differentiate those two. And with Annalena Baerbock announcing a feminist foreign policy and trying to really stick to her values, she has been confronted with crises like the multitude of crises that no other foreign minister in Germany had before. So that definitely does not make her expertise or her commitment to feminist foreign policy smaller. Quite the opposite. I feel that she's been extremely smart in how to stick to her very values of human security, human rights, equity for all, whilst dealing with one of the worst aggressors that we have seen.
Okay, there is a question here, and we have a microphone now being passed around. Yeah, it should be on.
I've got a question. No, obviously we're trying to talk about consensus here.
Sorry, 1 second. Go ahead.
So we're talking about consensus here and how to get people...
It might be better without the microphone. I'm sorry. If I just ask you to shout.
So the important stream, please. Okay, so we're talking about consensus and how to get people to think the same and to agree. I mean, what was interesting and completely surprising was when the Brexit voted for Brexit, because the bank thinks that it's going to be bad economically, yet they voted for Brexit. What people had in common when they voted for Brexit is that they were old. Young people voted for Remain, because they're young. So I like the comment from Frank that the West goes backwards and the East goes forwards. But generally, old people go backwards because the future life is short, their past life is long. What's happening in Europe is that they continue to get old, whereas Africa is very young, so obviously it's forward and backwards. The replacement age in Italy is 1.2, the average age is 62 or 63, are now going to vote on far-right government because they're moving backwards. Isn't one of the problems that there's just not enough young people in Europe to look forward, and the power systems of old people that continue to move backwards, as we've seen.
You can, Yvonne, if you wouldn't mind handing the mic to the man in the white. Does somebody in the meantime want to take on that question, if you were able to understand it? Isn't the problem in Europe that we're too old and don't have enough young people to look forward?
I can start, and maybe Frank, you want to pick up on that. Age is definitely one thing, because, I mean, just on a very purely mathematical scale, you have more years to live on average if you're young compared to when you're old. So the brain also changes in terms of, for example, its plasticity. So the older you get, the less plastic, the less changeable your brain is. So the more you stick to what you know, your habits become even stronger. That doesn't mean, as I said yesterday, that you can't change. Your brain changes all the time until you die, but it goes slower. And of course, every habit, the more you repeat it, it's really not linear, but definitely increasing relationship. The more you repeat one thing, the more you believe, and the more you are convinced, and the more you do certain things, because it really becomes this highway, so to say, in your brain. But it's not only related to age, because that's what you refer to as well. It's this thing whether you can lose or gain something.
Yes.
And that's really crucial to understand, I think, on the world stage, because that's why the people in Britain are now mourning the past, because they are really scared and afraid, and we all know what fear does to us. It makes us more stupid, because our clever brain parts are blocked, basically, and we are trying to survive. But anyways, so the people who can lose something, because they've been privileged, they've been in charge, they knew how the world worked, right? They want to keep that old state, of course. Whereas the people who see all the pictures from the people who live a better or supposedly better life, they are looking forward. Not only the young, so it's too simple to just use age here, but it's really your position in the world and compared to other countries especially.
And this means that you can change it. So because it's as well affecting young people. You cannot say, we are all old, we can't change it, and that's how it goes. If you talk about this position perspective, if you realize that if you're losing out position, you start to defending your old position, and if you see this is the wrong way, you have to actually open up to see new developments, and probably have to give up old routines and old habits. So there you have a choice, and that's actually very important, because the other argument goes, from my perspective, it goes too far into a direction we can't do anything, and that's how it is, and we basically all get older.
And that then, of course, also shows in liberation movements, right? Let's look at the anti-racist movement, again, the feminist movement, the climate movement. It is no coincidence that, for example, the climate movement is led by young women, and in I have a scientist next to me, so maybe you have a word to say on that, what I'm about to say. But there's, in climate justice research, you actually also talk about the white male effect, the fact that white men are not as engaged in the climate movement because they do not feel as the pressure to actually do something about it, because but it's the young, it's the women, it is the climate movement comes from indigenous folks, from people of color. Women of color have always been at the forefront, because they have nothing to keep, because they've not had anything. They've not been benefiting from the destructive, extractive capitalist system and extractive industries. And so it is them who are fighting, who have the vision. So if we're really considering who are our visionary thinkers and leaders in the world, it's not those who have built the world so far.
Mm-hmm. We have so many questions. You have the mic at the moment. There is a set of questions here, and I also want to make sure I don't miss anybody behind me. You had a question as well. Okay, so we'll start with this one here.
Oh, very interesting discussion. Ivan Gabor, Hungarian immigrant here in Germany.
You need to speak louder.
Yes. Yeah, okay.
Just shout.
So, if we had any learning yesterday, then it was that in crisis times, we do not have answers. So the main difference is that our brain probably, and this is a question already, used to have always to get answers. That's what we learned in school, that's what we learned in family, and that's why we always want to provide answers. And we can't stick just with questions. And here in the room, we are always trying to say that we are agree in things, and in the same time we are making divisions all the time between men, white. I am the enemy in the room, even heterosexual. Mm-hmm. Why we do this? This is one question. The second question is that could we say out loud that not gender is the main problem in the politics, and don't say that female is good, male is wrong, in the time of Giorgia Meloni's and Marine Le Pen's, and so on and so forth.
So this
and
is you
that
with your
I don't think that people are queuing in London right now because of the past. I think we all had the feeling that probably she was the only one in the last decades in political life who was thinking that the personality is less important than the work.
But that's past.
I would say that
It's over. Definitely over.
it would be the future to have politicians that they don't put their personality in the front and to do politics for living, just to serve in the best sense of the word.
I understand.
But that's,
Point.
before I answer the question, that's the perfect example, like your exchange right now for this perspective taking, right? And that's why it's so important to listen to each other. And I don't want to sound too idealistic here. It's funny, like if you say, yeah, you need to listen to each other, say, yeah, come on, go back. It's naive to believe that, right? But I really mean it. Like, this was a perfect example, and you haven't staged this, of listening to each other. And then Frank said, oh yeah, right, this is a different perspective. And then something starts in your head, and you're actually able to learn, and you're actually consciously trying to reconsider your position. And that brings me to the question of safety and habits, or what you refer to maybe as uncertainty. Our brain is always looking for certainty. So when the crisis hits, or when we feel, think, believe, perceive that there is a crisis, that something is changing, our brain loses this certainty mode, the habit mode. On an average day, 95% of our things that we do and think and believe are habits. And this is why it's important, or it's important in order to understand that, to realize that this brain in our head is actually what I often call the Stone Age brain. And I don't mean it in a bad or mean way. I also have a Stone Age brain. I'm not insulting anybody, I hope, here. But that's because this mechanism, or these mechanisms, it's multiple ones, they are that old. They are older than male domination or whatever. They are really old. And they basically are important to understand, and that's why I claim that we need more psychology on the political stage. Just some basics. Not everybody needs to study psychology, don't be scared. But to understand, this is our brain trying to protect us. So when we go into this uncertainty mode, our brain can no longer make predictions. And that's really bad. Or when it makes predictions, there's always a big prediction error. So we believe, okay, we always did it this way. We always looked up at the Queen, or we walked to the office, and then the pandemic hit, or whatever, right? That creates uncertainty. Or we were in charge. That creates uncertainty. And then our brain doesn't know what to do, because it has all these habits and all these routines in order to save energy. So then now we have to use that energy to come up with new things. And now the question is really, how do we look at these new things? Do we look at it as chances, or are we scared and trying to protect? And that brings me back to the first question you asked me, like the defense mode, right? Because then we try to either get even closer, and that's what we see historically. I'm not a historian, but when I look at history with a psychological perspective, you see that whenever people are really uncertain, they are most open for the easy answers.
Yes. True.
I first of all would like to assure you that, but also maybe Frank sitting next to me, that you're most definitely not the enemy in this room. You as individuals, most definitely never, unless you do something terrible, then we can talk about that again. And at the same time, whilst this is a truth, something else is a truth, that others historically have been viewed as enemies, and because of that been oppressed. And I'm all for really looking at this feminist thing, you said gender, with like a very sober and calm mindset. And this is what we need. Like, we need to look at the facts historically, because when we now talk about we need more diversity, we need to include all voices, it's not about demonizing white men. It's about making the point, the past hundreds of years, we've only heard you and listened to you, and only your ideas mattered. And this needs to change. It's not about demonizing, it's about stating the historical facts. Because if, for example, you know, when Kamala Harris was elected vice president in the whole world, people were celebrating, I was celebrating, everyone was like, hell yes, finally a woman of color in this position, vice president, not even president. And so many voices said, finally a woman makes it to a position that that men have done for so many years. And the narrative too often is, finally a woman is good enough. But that's not the right story. The right story is that someone like Kamala Harris, until a bit more than 100 years ago, she was not politically franchised. Like, she was not allowed to vote. As a woman of color in the US, in many states, even until the 60s. As a black person until the 60s, there was segregation. As a woman until the 70s, she was not allowed to have a bank account. Quickly coming back to Germany, in Germany until 77, women were not allowed to have bank accounts. The institution of the marriage in the late 19th century was implemented to make women dependent on men. In Germany until 1997, women were allowed to legally be raped in marriage. Like, in the historically, laws have been invented by those who had the power to make laws, to keep so many, like with so much force, out of the political space and out of decision-making spheres, that we need to state this. And when nowadays we talk about the importance of the feminist movement to break up those structures and to change those laws. I was involved when in 2016 we changed the German rape law to no means no, because until 2016 the victim in Germany had to, and victim in cases of rape, over 90% women, the victim had to prove that she physically fought the perpetrator. That was until 2016. We have this history of rules that kept so many and still keep so many people from decision-making powers. And we must name this, because otherwise we cannot do better looking into the future and build better structures where all experiences and needs are included. So again, the white male is not the enemy. And at the same time, tolerance of ambiguity, many people, we as a society, need to listen to those facts to build a better society and future.
Can I add one sentence? Because this now brings it, I think, not all, but a lot together, what you just said. When you asked the question, oh, what's the difference between asking the what are we against compared to what are we for, and the groups and the perspectives and looking to the past. Because if we look at the past, then we immediately have these groups, and we have this feeling that then white, male, heterosexual individuals believe, okay, I'm now the bad person in the room, and we create these groups, and we think about, okay, this group and all these individuals who belong to these groups are doing something wrong. But if we ask ourselves, where do we want to go to? Because we then, if we look backwards, say, okay, we are against discrimination, and then it becomes a very complicated and long discussion, and we still have the feeling, okay, there is this kind of tendency and this feeling, right, that you raised and that you mentioned, and I'm really happy that you asked that question. It's still somehow there. But if we force, in a positive way, ourselves to ask, okay, where do we want to go to? Immediately these groups dissolve. It's like this tablet that you put into water, the vitamin pills. It dissolves in the water, right? Because then it doesn't matter what skin color you have. It really is about, okay, we want to have a society where everybody can speak up if they have a point. And that's different, because then we stop demonizing certain individuals, groups, and so on. So it's a perfect example, I think.
When I see you talk, when I listen to you talking, the Asians talk in the same way about the West, and there's strong similarities, and that's quite obvious that they have the same kind of problems you mentioned. Different content, but structurally the problems are the same.
Thank you. And we're getting short on time, so I'm going to ask to gather a few questions if we can. We had two here. I think that's okay. Okay, so I'd maybe gather a question here, and then hand the mic back there. Okay. We'll gather 3 questions at the moment, so please go ahead.
Okay, thank you first of all. Thank you for the conference at all. I joined yesterday very much, and I enjoyed this panel as well. And the conference underlines the times of transformation we live in. Yes, we come from a stable, wealthy past. Now we live in a present that doesn't work any longer, but we don't have a vision for the tomorrow, for the future. Yeah, and I think the future is more than the present, and it's in a different way than the present. Maybe totally different. Yeah, but the only picture of the future we have still in this room is that we fear the future because it won't be as stable and wealthy than the past. Yeah. Sure. So politically, we are children of the era Angela Merkel or Frank-Walter Steinmeier. Yeah, we are very pragmatic, very sober, very boring. We made a lot of bad decisions, Russian gas, for example. Yeah, we lived on the cost of our children and even all of the young people here sitting in this room. Yeah, the main point is we don't have a vision of the future world, a better, a brighter, a greener, a more democratic, more equal, more wealthy world. Yeah, and so populism and new authoritarianism is the pictures we fight against. Yeah. We don't have a vision of the future, a positive vision of the future.
If you say we, who are we?
Me, my generation, your generation.
I have a vision.
The bad one, the wrong one, I think. Yeah?
I don't think so.
Because if you had a good vision, we would laugh at the ideas of Xi Jinping and Putin or Trump or Boris Johnson.
Could I ask you to put your question directly? Sorry, just so we make sure we get through all of them.
I hope that maybe the conference focuses too much on the immediate present and not on the spectacular vision of the future. I learned the Realität wird schon richten, yeah, or maybe our Stone Age brain, but we have to work on the visions of the future.
Okay, thank you. And if you could hand the mic on.
Come on.
We're just going to gather a few and then you guys.
Thank you very much. I'll make it very short. I love the thinking very much, and I like to pick up on the first question, on the first statement of Maren Urner. She talked about dynamic thinking and said, okay, if we're going to go forward, we have to pick up on one idea. What do I want to achieve? Yesterday, the mayor of Tallinn said, we're coming to a limit of formats of governments because the crisis is so big that we have to redesign government. My question is, how can we apply this thinking, Maren, into the rituals of international powerhouses and conferences? Because we use up so much time sitting in circles and sitting in parliaments and with people who are very smart and where the knowledge is around, but nothing really changes so quick. So how do we apply this thinking in new formats, in new forms of conferences, and new forms of communication? That's my question.
Thank you. I've written that down, and if we could get the microphone here, can I just grab this from you? Hand it back.
Wow, I got the microphone. I'm the first woman from the audience talking. I'm kidding, I'm sorry. I couldn't drop that. Well, there has been a lot of different, very interesting aspects. So I'm really trying to, with the time limit, to just kind of gather of all the small impacts. So I think in the beginning and also yesterday, we are talking about values and how we should, as let's say we, the Western world, should try to convince the rest, the emerging countries, from the very great values that we have. I just want to point out that given the long time of colonialism and Western dominance, there are a lot of concepts that we also exported in the world, like nation state, sovereignty, patriarchy, and other things. So we kind of have to find what kind of values we're talking about here, because I think that the power hungry of the world, and we also talk about Bolsonaro, Putin, Trump, etc., and we actually, this is very global. So it's not only Western men we're talking about, white men we're talking about. So maybe we should think about the idea that there are always people who want to benefit from certain mindsets and power dynamics, and it's not that it's a Western concept or not, wherever it comes from, it exists. So like questioning these, and of course, the experiences of marginalized groups, women and others, are important to challenge that, but it's not a blueprint. Like if we only have women in power, won't change if we still keep the same power aspects. So of course, I think in the sense of feminist foreign policy or feminist approach to politics, it's not the feminine that we're talking about, it's the concept behind that we're challenging, like the dominant concept that has been here. So I'm sorry, might not be really a question. You are very, I would be happy to hear your thoughts about it, more an input than anything else.
But basically, you're talking about different groups and layers of groups. And the question is, at the end, which group I feel strong, I feel, which belonging to group I feel stronger. And this is probably, in different world areas, it's probably different. And that's probably something we need to see clearly, that, for example, from a perspective of the South or of Asia, this Western dominance is a very, very important thing, and probably more important than political systems. On a second grade, the political systems become very important as well. But what we probably need to see the different layers, and that the layers of that these layers are probably different from a Western perspective than from Asian or South American or African perspective. I think if we value every group equally, it's probably not realistic.
And perhaps the other two questions, which was, one was, we don't have a vision of the future, and then the other question was to you, Maren, about bringing this mindset into conferences.
Yeah. Not only conferences, but I think all heads in the world. That's what I'm trying to do. That's why I'm no longer sleeping. Joke aside, I think it's really important that on a political stage, and that's what I meant when I said we need more psychological or basic psychological understanding when we do politics. And we need to stop separating. Again, we are separating and labels here, separating between, let's say, the official side and the unofficial or personal and private side or whatsoever. Because there's a lot of time lost, as you said, I think, as well, by just doing things in certain ways and not really cutting to the chase. There's this good expression in English, and really talking about what do we want to go, where do we want to go to? And that connects to the first question, right? But in order to do that, we need people who are sitting on these, let's say, tables and in these rooms that have this knowledge. They need to have this knowledge. And again, I'm not claiming that everybody who wants to go into politics or wants to have a certain decision responsibility and so on, or leadership, has to study psychology on top of what they are studying or learning or doing anyways. But really to set up, and this is really important, a structure, incentive structure as well, that realize or that make sure that we applaud the people who are doing this and not the people who are trying to stick to some kind of old, and this is the opposite of the dynamic thinking, the static thinking. So this is why it's also important not to blame the politics or the people for not doing enough, but to really always ask, what can I do, depending on what group I'm currently in. Because as I said, I'm a private person, but I'm also a neuroscience and so on. And you all have different groups you belong to all the time. And depending on which group and role I'm currently in, what can I do in order to make it better, in order to practice this dynamic thinking? And then we have to vote or somehow elect people into the positions, the people who are in charge that have that knowledge in order to cut, the bullshit. Because we don't have much time left. Thank you.
That's a clear statement. We only have about 10 minutes or so left, so I'm going to ask to take 4 questions. There's 2 behind me, one in the row back there who's been waiting, and the gentleman here's been waiting. I'd ask that you please keep your questions short, and we will take them in the time that we have.
Imagine a wild animal, aggressive, seeing you as food. And I'm hearing here, it's a good idea to start a dialogue about a joint future. I'm illustrating this because for me that's reflecting the situation we have in Europe versus Ukraine versus Russia. And I'm hearing here it's good to have a dialogue with somebody that already explained that he has a completely different vision than we have about the future. So the question for you is how to deal with people that are explaining in detail their completely different vision about the future and are maybe not listening to you anymore. That's what many political leaders explained, that Putin is not listening and is not interested in having any dialogue.
Thanks for that question. Oh yeah, go ahead. Just if you could wait for the microphone. Thanks, that helps for our stream. Thank you.
Thank you to the speakers and to the moderator for this discussion. I have first a tiny question to Frank. Frank, do you have Chinese citizenship?
No.
No, just interested. Okay.
Just a question.
So, my point here is that you're basically talking about the absence of objectivity, which I agree to, but what you essentially fail to recognize, ironically, because of your perspective, is that dialogue in itself is already a virtue. It is an accomplishment, an achievement of our society. So, and it's not recognized as a positive thing or as a virtue in, unfortunately, in China and in Russia. So they just don't care if we have a dialogue or not. It's just.
I do not agree. There's lots of dialogue in Asia between Chinese and other countries. They just, as I said, they just built the biggest free trade zone in the world, and it took like 8 years to negotiate. It's basically it's not true. I don't know so much about about Russia and Putin, but for Asia, I can say dialogue, including China, is playing a very, very important role. And in some ways, it's for them, they're more successful in talk to each other despite big differences, as I was mentioning already, like different religions, different political systems, different sizes, and different development statuses. So I would not say that dialogue is something which is which is something which is a strong advantage of the West. You also have it in Asia and Africa, same thing.
But that comes back to the first question we heard, which I think, Maren, you wanted to answer. What happens with dialogue when you're speaking to someone who's not interested in listening?
Yeah, so we're back at the Stone Age brain, so I'm very happy for that example, because I always talk about the saber-toothed tiger or the mammoth approaching you, and then what do? Well, you don't sit down and have a dialogue with that animal, because, well, that's probably the last thing you ever do. And that's where our Stone Age brain has these survival mechanisms that I already shortly referred to, the fight, flight, or freeze response. And what that brings us, if we look at it more from a meta level too, is this short-term thinking, right? Because it doesn't make sense, literally it doesn't make sense to think about what will happen in 10 or 20 years when there's immediate danger, be it an aggressor, be it a flood, be it something else that's threatening our life. Because if we are dead, nothing else makes sense. So we first have to make sure that we survive. So that's very important to realize. When do we face these situations where short-term thinking, of course, is important or actually life-saving? But now we created structures, and I'm coming back to the previous point I made, where we always or most often focus on these short-term solutions, because our brain is wired to do that, because it's easier. It takes a lot more work to do the long-term thinking. Anybody ever try to change a habit, like doing sports, eating healthy, sleeping early, all these kind of things? And that's why the private is political, because it's hard, but the cost-benefit analysis, and I'm pretty sure you love cost-benefit analysis, because everything in life is one. You put something in, you get something out, and then you look whether it was good or bad. Yeah, and that's the same here. We have to put something in order to get a lot out, and that's why dialogue is work. That's why it's hard to listen to other people, even if you first think, oh, this person is completely stupid, or this perspective I don't want to listen to. But it's really worth it, and it's the only chance we have, because that's, again, bringing home this point that future and sustainability, they're basically the same. Otherwise, we're destroying the very basic of our life. The most important thing we need is food. And if we have people fighting each other because of other stupid things, there will be no food left for anybody.
This is beautiful. And it just makes me realize again how, I mean, you've been mentioning the importance of psychology all the time. I did my bachelor's in psychology, my master's in politics, and in between spent the summer in an institute on political psychology, and again realizing how this is the most powerful combination, because what you have just been explaining, and I want to get back to that question here as well, because I've been asked this in interviews a lot on feminist foreign policy. We have a war now, and you want to come with like women's rights and blah, and like it doesn't make sense. Putin's going to kill people, and you are against, and you are in favor of demilitarization. Like that's been the question, and that is kind of the same context. So what I used to say is that feminist foreign policy is really excellent at distinguishing at short, medium, and long term. So in the short term. So in the short term, feminists, everyone who's in favor of human security has never, ever not supported someone's self-defense. Be it a woman who's being attacked by a man, this woman has the right to defend herself as much as possible. The same for people who are faced with the massive violence. They need to be supported in a way that they are asking for help. And that's not only supported by the UN Charter, it just makes sense from a human perspective. But feminist foreign policy was never about reacting to those immediate outbursts of violence. It is aware of it, and precisely because of that, in the long term, feminists have been proposing a better vision for the future. That is why feminists, including myself, we've been criticizing the 100 billion that Scholz and the government announced for militarization, and announcing militarization as the key solution to a war, when militarization is the reason for the war, instead of spending the same amount of money on civilian peace building, improving international law, diplomacy, supporting human rights defenders. There's like a whole list of demands by feminists of how in the very long term we can build structures where militarization is, I mean, we live in a hyper militarized state. That is not a natural law. That's not a Naturgesetz. That's been decisions, and societies can be built differently. I like the comparison of, imagine you're building a small village, and you're comparing that to building societies. You're building a small village, and you're not using the best quality for building the houses. So you use materials that are easily inflammable, that you can easily light fire. So you use rubbish material and then realize, oh, fire can break out any time. So we're spending lots of money on the fire brigade. If you translate that into building societies, we've been building societies that are not strong and not resilient, that prioritize a minority over the majority. And whilst building that, we've been spending lots on militarization and always prepared to use violence to react to problems. And that's been a societal structure for hundreds of years. So in a feminist approach, has this long-term vision of redirecting money to build futures where the second that people, for example, say, okay, minority rights are being attacked in Russia, LGBTQI rights are being attacked, domestic violence is being legalized again. We have like these signs we have seen for so many years, and civil society has always been saying, if this is how it's like, when it starts like this, that minority rights are being massively attacked, more worse things will come. So intervention should have happened then. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we only had these last two questions, and then we need to wrap up, unfortunately. So I just ask for them to be brief.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for raising our attention, both on a private and political level. And as we heard yesterday, cities are balancing in between these two, which is the most interesting for us now. To consider conversations. I think we started considering conversations as speaking well and gently, yet with the aim to convince. And with this discussion, I think we opened up enough that we complement our communication with listening enough to maybe be convinced, even if we have passionate beliefs, and not to mistake the truth to our own values. And Frank was very right in the morning to point it out that our values might be or not validated in different parts of the world. And to keep this openness, I invite you for a game. I'm an architect working in learning spaces, and our Stone Age brain goes into the defense mode in 20 seconds after we sit down. So if we come back after the break, I invite you to sit at a completely different spot, because it really makes a change, rewires our brains a bit differently, and maybe help us to maintain this openness that you promoted. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to say that's really great, and I wouldn't even call it a game, but maybe we can make that into it. But it's good to also call it a game, because then it's inviting. Framing is everything. But it's really important because literally to take a different perspective. And that's so nice about architecture and thinking about culture and where do we always sit. If you sit in a different spot now, when you come back, it really changes your perspective, not only on the things that are said, but also literally in your brain, because you see the world from a different perspective. So try it wherever you go. Really, really thankful for your comment.
And I have to give the last word to the woman here in red. You had a question. You did not.
I had a question. I guess the point is already quite old. Maybe I just want to make the comment that I think it's important to underline that group identities can change.
Yeah. Like when you talked about like this post-colonial argument about the West being an aristocracy, and I just felt like, yeah, maybe like not all Asian countries will see like the Russian embargo or all this as an aristocratic problem, but Taiwan might see this differently. So this, yeah, my main point was that it's a little bit more complicated than just seeing the West, because it depends on democratic values and values in general. Values can change, group identity can change. And I just wanted to make this point a little bit stronger, but maybe we'll talk later a bit about this.
Thank you for that
Thanks.
point. And I think that's a good note to wrap up on. This has been a really dynamic discussion. Thank you all for this. Round of applause for the speakers. You guys were terrific. We're going to take an hour break for an early lunch. Join us back here in a different seat at 12:45, and we'll continue with a discussion on urban mobility.
Cool. Super.